Good. Welcome to this session of the Center for the Economics of the Internet. Very pleased to have all of you here today, and very pleased to have our distinguished speaker, Commissioner Robert McDowell, recently of the Federal Communications Commission, and recently joined here at the Hudson Institute. Before we begin with Commissioner McDowell, a few housekeeping matters. First of all, I'm very pleased to make a couple of announcements. One is Jeffrey Lee, recently at Hudson University, will be joining the center as a research associate to help out with research for the center. He'll be beginning in August, and very much look forward to having him on board. Second, I have a paper on spectrum auctions called Open Spectrum that will be posted at the center website the next couple of days. Third, we have a couple of upcoming seminars, and one I was just speaking with Commissioner McDowell about. We'll have a repeat performance in early July, and I need to check with the folks who manage the center here, but it probably will be the week of July 8th. We'll be discussing the future of network neutrality, depending on how the court case comes out on that, and that should be a lot of fun. Commissioner Robert McDowell needs no introduction. He has been one of the stalwarts of free market approaches at the Federal Communications Commission over the past several years. He began his tenure in 2006, is that right? And you were just telling me this would have been your 7th anniversary?
Tomorrow, yeah.
That is a very long time.
Yes, it is too long.
Commissioner McDowell has many wonderful statements from his tenure at the FCC, and I think it is a good forecast for the type of comments that we're going to be having today here as we welcome Commissioner McDowell. Newly joining the private sector after years of public service. And you've seen both the good parts and maybe the not so good parts of how the government can operate. So I'd like to begin by just asking your general thoughts about how the Communications Act, which governs communications regulation, is doing. Every year there's discussion about Congress rewriting the act. It's a very hard thing to do. It doesn't happen very often. Wanted to get your thoughts about how you think the act is doing, and if it were to be modified in some way, how would you think it should go about being modified?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a tremendous honor to be affiliated with the Hudson Institute as a visiting fellow, and hopefully I'll be a jolly good one as well. This is a tremendous institution with a terrific roots and some very deep intellectual thought over the decades, and hopefully we can continue to help the mission here. So I'm very flattered and honored to be a part of that. And it's good to see you. And this is a huge crowd. I see in the front rows. It looks like I've never left the commission. A lot of faces here, including Tasha Kinney from my office. So just 2 weeks ago, anyway, with my office, I'm freshly hatched out of the commission. And so finally, to get around to your question, you're wondering if that was ever going to happen, probably. The act does need updating. Telecom Act of 1996 in internet time, that was an eon ago. The act is still, the foundation is really still built on the 1934 Act in a lot of ways. In other ways, it's sort of a mishmash of sort of retrofitted ideas on this old and creaky foundation. So, for instance, if a I try to look at consumption habits through the eyes of my children. Excuse me. And I know that sounds corny, but that's actually how I do it. And they really don't care how they're getting their content or how they're sending the content they're generating back up. They don't really care what type of technology it is, so long as it meets their needs. If it happened to be over twisted copper pair, there would be one set of rules. If it's wireless in one way, there would be another set of rules. If it's wireless in another way, another set of rules. Wireless in yet another way, in terms of over-the-air broadcast television, yet another set of rules. If it's coaxial cable, another set of rules. So the idea of distinguishing rules or the law based on the legacy technology used really isn't pragmatic, doesn't fit the realities of the modern day marketplace any longer, if it ever did. I think we should be looking at all this through the lens of consumer harm. Is there the presence of market power? Is there abuse of that power? And does that result in consumer harm? And what can be tailored in a very narrowly tailored way to cure that consumer harm while sunsetting that provision, to have the rules and regulations and laws reviewed every so often to see if they're needed at all. Because this marketplace, the communications marketplace writ large, is energetic and dynamic and evolving every minute of every day. And having these legacy rules hang over it all, I think, can squelch innovation and investment. And it's impossible if at best, it's very difficult to measure what innovations don't make it to the marketplace due to a government-created distortion. So, for those that are concerned about consumer harm, let's look at it through that lens and approach a rewrite in that spirit.
So, consumer harm. Would you view this as something of an antitrust approach to regulation?
It could be antitrust approach / competition law.
Protection.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Have you you meet with members of Congress periodically as a commissioner, and have you had discussions with members that would lead you to believe that there is some likelihood of a redraft coming, or what is your gauge of the sentiment on Capitol Hill to actually rewriting the act?
Well, in case folks hadn't noticed, there's a divided Congress. So we have the House of Representatives controlled by one party and the Senate presided over by another party. I'm not sure anyone controls the Senate, but so I say presided over. So there's that aspect which makes it difficult to pass legislation in the short term, I think. And there's also got to be a driving need among many stakeholders interested. And I'm not sure I've seen the big push by some of the stakeholders who could actually start to get legislation moving. Senator Chairman Rockefeller, has announced his plans to retire at the end of this cycle and at the end of his term. That tells me that he's less likely to want to push a comprehensive rewrite through here in the next year and a half. So I think we can write off the next year and a half. Keep in mind that the Telecom Act in '96 took about a decade or 12 years, depending on how you want to measure it, to pass. And it's hard to do. It's something that's very, very hard to do. So I wouldn't look for anything meaningful happening for a minimum of about 4 years, because there's also a presidential election. So I don't know if this is something that could be done, in the last 2 terms of a presidency. Perhaps it could, depends on the next election cycle. But so 4 to 8 years from now, maybe we can start to see some work done. But it'll take time, but it absolutely has to be done, I think.
One of the areas that you've spent a lot of time and I think provided a lot of wisdom for the American public was on international regulation of the Internet and efforts by the International Telecommunications Union to assert itself in this area and what the United States should do. And some of this has to do with our Communications Act, which is very much about the law being in the four corners of the United States, so to speak, and yet the internet is very much has an international presence. How do you see the future of international telecommunications, international internet, and what is the proper role, if any, between government institutions, both in the United States and abroad, and the internet?
So earlier this week, I was on the West Coast working with the Annenberg Foundation in conjunction with Brookings, and also now, I guess, Hudson, because I was there. And we were examining the issue of what they're calling cross-border data flow in the Asia-Pacific region in particular. And there were more trade people, international trade experts there than there were regulatory folks or international regulatory folks. And that's interesting. Obviously, in FCC land, we think of regulatory and treaties in that regard. So having the international trade folks there who work on all sorts of other issues, they're talking about sugar and things like that. Apparently sugar is very controversial, but that's something I didn't know. So it's good to have that perspective there. So we'll see where this effort goes over the next year or so in this what's called the Annenberg-Dreyer Commission. Former Congressman David Dreyer leading this commission, but really taking a hard look at these issues through the lens of trade law, trade international law. But overall, the thrust thus far is in the wrong direction. So for decades, the consensus was internationally that governments should keep their hands off of the space, the markets that became known as the internet sector. But over the years, there were a lot of countries, as many of you now know, who've been quietly and persistently trying to change that for a variety of motivations, I think, but they're trying to create a new international regulatory overlay of internet governance so that the operations, content, and economics of the internet ecosystem. And due to their patience and incremental approach, their persistence, they are winning, as we saw in Dubai. So the ITU, which historically, so this is a treaty-based organization, essentially an arm of the United Nations, to oversimplify it a little bit. The ITU historically has always worked through consensus, really basically unanimous consensus. Hard votes were rarely, if ever, taken. And the last time it examined the issue of internet governance and things of that nature was in 1988. There were 114 member countries that convened in Australia back then, and there's unanimous consensus that the ITU should stay out of that space. And we were told by ITU leadership leading up to the World Conference on International Telecommunications, the WICET, last December in Dubai. So prior to last December, ITU leadership was saying, A, would not touch the internet, the treaty negotiation. B, there would be unanimous consensus. And there were some other things said as well, none of which turned out to be true. There was, you had 40% of the member states who showed up who did not sign on to the treaty. They have until January 1st of 2015 to sign on. But it was a debacle, and it's created a tremendous amount of uncertainty. There are a few things that were left behind that did not get adopted, like this notion of sending party pays, which the concept being a web destination that generates a lot of traffic on a telecoms network should be paying that telecoms network through some sort of international regulatory regime. It could be a tariff regime or something else. But the idea that the web destination is a sending party from an engineering perspective is just a fallacy. It's being pulled by the user. You're pulling the content. If you're going to YouTube, for instance, you're pulling that content. YouTube's not just sending it to you. And there's the idea of the right to contract. So allow businesses to work this out on their own, either between consumers or business to business or whatever the case might be. That was not adopted. That was considered a victory for the Obama administration, by the Obama administration. But that will be something that comes up in a year and a half, starting in late October in Korea, in South Korea. There will be essentially a constitutional convention convened of the ITU, where they will literally rewrite their constitution, and they will elect a new Secretary General. The leading candidate right now is Hulan Zhao, who's the Deputy Secretary General from China. Very charismatic, but China has been one of the countries pushing the hardest for some of these regulations. One of the holy grails for China in terms of internet governance is to have an international registry, and I'm not making this up, to have an international registry of all IP addresses. So that's every device you've got with you right now. Ultimately, your refrigerator and your car will have IP addresses and things like that. So all personal computers, all mobile devices, and this would be under the auspices of helping to manage network congestion or cybersecurity protection, things of that nature. But it would link each IP address with an individual. And I think we could start to fill in the blanks as to what maybe the true motivations are. But there's that type of thing at risk. This sounds like black helicopter conspiracy theory, but it's actually in their filings at the ITU as well as on the floor of the United Nations itself. And Russia, I think it was Russia, was it Tajikistan or Uzbekistan, China, year and a half ago, proposed this on the floor of the UN. Now, 5-10 years ago, the notion of the ITU having any role in internet governance would have been laughed at. You would have been thought to have been half crazy if you'd raised the idea, but then it became a reality in Dubai. So I think we can learn from what happened there, and that ITU leadership misled the world. And the other side is able to show up with a majority of votes. It's one country, one vote. Doesn't matter if you're San Marino or Vatican City or China. It's not dependent upon population. It's one country, one vote. So a lot can be done. And China and Russia, Saudi Arabia, and their client states can walk in there with a lot of votes right off the bat. So in the intermediate term, I am pessimistic. Normally, I'm a pretty sunny optimist on things. In the longer term, and this is maybe a longer-winded answer than you wanted, but in the longer term, I'm more of an optimist in that the architecture, the physical architecture of the internet defies top-down authoritarianism, and there's always going to be a workaround. So there are hundreds of millions of people in China, individuals yearning to breathe free, and are at this moment working around the Great Firewall of China to try to get the information they want and need. And that is happening despite the Chinese government spending who knows how much money and employing hundreds of thousands of people to censor the net and control what the people see. So that's encouraging. We can also see what during the Arab Spring, the Egyptian government tried to implement essentially an internet kill switch to shut off internet access. And within hours, there were workarounds, and within just a few days, there was basically total restoration. So the physical architecture of it makes it very difficult to have these top-down choke points. And so at the end of the day, I think it's very empowering to the sovereignty of the individual, and we'll start to reform geopolitics as a result. Other than that, it's not that important.
There seem to be two policy directions in our government that at times are aligned and at times seem to be in conflict with one another. One is the empowerment of the individual, much as you described, from the internet, and the other is concern about cybersecurity. cyber warfare and efforts of foreign governments or foreign bad guys, whether they're governments or not, to use the internet for bad purposes. How do you see these issues being resolved by our government, and how do you see, maybe they're not in conflict at all, how do you see our administration as having, trying to deal with both of these sets of issues?
And there are a number of tensions there, and cybersecurity is increasingly becoming a problem for governments and for the private sector as well. It's been published many times. For instance, the Chinese government using cyber espionage to steal intellectual property and trade secrets, and to then use for their own purposes domestically. And if you're in the private sector or the government, either way, retaliating is then considered a cyber attack in and of itself. So you have less of a deterrent than if there's no cost to doing these things. What I think we need to avoid, though, is too much centralization in response. First of all, again, there's that architecture problem with that. But also, if things are diffused, they become harder to disrupt or take down, shut down, and that is again how really the architecture lends itself is to more sort of diffusion. But in the name of cybersecurity, I think we have to be very careful to not centralize government authority. Because that can be abused, because it won't work as well. There'll be more of a single point of failure. There are a lot of reasons, but that seems to be at the heart of the tension of a lot of the debate on cybersecurity policy right now. But it's going to be an increasing economic problem, cybersecurity. I mean, there's just a cost associated with it, and so there are not any easy solutions at this point. Sorry.
And throughout our government, we have a lot of different agencies that are working on cybersecurity issues. Any sense of coordination? Has this been working well, or?
I don't think it necessarily has been working all that well, and we have yet to see a major catastrophe. That day will come, and then we'll, at some point, and then I guess we'll be learning from it. We just hope it's not so much of a catastrophe as to where there's any serious long-term damage. Coordination within the government is maybe better than it was 15 years ago, but there also has to be private sector coordination as well. There's far more at risk, as much at risk in the private sector, I think. I mean, but there are more players in the private sector and more targets within the private sector is what I mean by that. So coordination is important. You want some coordination. You want a certain amount of centralization, but you don't want too much.
And we certainly don't want coordination with the ITU, for example, or
exactly
whoever may be in charge of it at that particular point in time.
Well, and again, I don't mean to be picking on China today, but so China at the ITU, they do want more ITU involvement in cybersecurity. And if you look back at the Cold War days, a lot of these policies Hudson was right in the middle of. The other side of the Cold War debates would want treaties that we would abide by and they would not. And that was the MO. And I think that's probably going to be the MO with attempts at any sort of international codification of a treaty or rules on cybersecurity. Look for the other side to want to have us live by the rules, and they'll break the rules.
Let's move on to one of the choke points for getting more broadband out in the United States, which is spectrum. The commission has taken a lot of steps while you've been a commissioner to try to get more spectrum out for the American public. and yet there've been challenges as well. How do you see spectrum markets in the United States today, and how you think they may change in the next few years, particularly with respect to the potential auction of broadcaster spectrum?
So regarding the incentive auctions, we'll just start with that because it's more immediate. I am less optimistic that it will be a smashing success. I hope I'm wrong. This is one thing I really hope I'm wrong, but some things need to change, I think, to make it more of a success. So first thing you need to do is you need to have an incentive for broadcasters to relinquish their spectrum. And that means a lot of things. Keeping it simple. There are the three parts of it. There's the reverse auction. How cheaply will the broadcasters relinquish their spectrum? The forward auction. How expensively will the bidders pay for that spectrum? And then there's the repacking, where will be the wireless neighborhood versus the broadcaster neighborhood. There are obviously many, many other moving parts to that too, but those are three big areas. I've been told by many broadcasters and some economists advising them that the notion of a simultaneous reverse and forward auction is confusing and opaque and breeds uncertainty. And that uncertainty means that people are less likely to be sellers, or as many sellers. Now, there's a lot of game theory involved. I'm not a game theorist. I'm not an economist. You are, so I'd love to hear your opinion on this too. But it has been my experience. I was at the commission for the two largest spectrum auctions, the AWS one and 700 megahertz, and I think the lessons derived from those were, keep it simple. Keeping it simple actually makes for a much more successful auction. Don't try to show how smart you are by making it overly complex, because that's going to have unintended consequences. And one example of that is all the conditions on the C block in the 700 megahertz auction. There were conditions put on there, open access conditions and sort of net neutrality type conditions, with the idea of this would make it attractive for a new entrant into the wireless space. The idea at the time was it would be Google. And Google advocated for these conditions, and they were going to participate at auction. And I remember at the time, during the comment phase, kind of scratching my head thinking, why don't you just buy it anyway? Then you don't have to have if you want to abide by those conditions, it's your license, it's an exclusive use license, you could do that. So why are you asking for the condition to be put in before you buy it? Maybe it's to keep the price low so you get a discount. Okay, so maybe that's it. In any case, I dissented. That was my first dissent at the FCC, was on the C block. And what ended up happening is that Google decided not to bid beyond 77 cents per megahertz pop, how we value spectrum. The A and the B blocks went for about triple that. And so the less regulated blocks went for almost 3 times what the C block went for. And Verizon got the C block for 77 cents, so a relative bargain, but for the conditions it had to figure out what they meant. That was an unintended consequence. The public policy objective was to attract a new nationwide wireless broadband provider, and that didn't happen. Same with the D block. The D block, which I did vote for, that's a vote that I regret. Public safety, there's the idea of having a public-private partnership in public safety, and what can we do to get the 24 megahertz that had been set aside in 1997 by Congress built out with private money, and that's we'll add another 10 megahertz next to it, which became the D block, and so in theory a private sector operator could have some use of all or part of that in conjunction or sharing with public safety. And by the way, 34 megahertz of the 700 megahertz band is a ton of spectrum for those who aren't familiar. It's just a lot of spectrum. So public safety was handed the pen and a blank sheet of paper and asked to fill out their Christmas wish list as to what they wanted with the D block, what were the conditions, what were the specs, and all the rest. I voted for it because public safety wanted it, and this was the idea. When it came to auction time, nobody bid on it. It was far too complicated. And that's a vote I regret, but I learned a lot, so I consider it a little bit of a tuition. So those two examples right there are sort of proof that when you make something too complicated in a spectrum auction, you're going to end up with negative results, and maybe they're unintended. But the concept of somehow the FCC can push and pull policy levers to create a superior outcome is really a fallacy, and history has disproved that theorem. So I hope it's simple, but it may not be. So the idea of it yielding 60 megahertz, we'll see, and I always like to ask 60 megahertz where?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned public safety. Public safety is in the new law, and the commission will be addressing it. One way of reading the statute is they're supposed to come up with $7 billion for public safety. There are a lot of objectives. And the commission came up with an NPRM that frankly doesn't seem to match your keep it simple approach. It seems very complicated. What do you see as the potential timing of the auction? If you had to take an educated guess, and your guess is probably more educated than most people at this point.
I'm a little pessimistic on this point too. So a lot of it has to do with politics. So I'll just think out loud for a minute. So it could be the fourth quarter before we see a new chairman and another commissioner installed. Will there be major orders issued on the incentive auction under my friend acting chair Mignon Clyburn? Is a question that needs to be answered. But with the background check phase and the pairing of the Republican and the Democrat for nomination and confirmation purposes, coupled with the political climate this year, right about now in Washington, it doesn't bode well for any sort of speedy confirmation process. In fact, I can envision a scenario where we have now sort of a trifecta of scandals that are evolving by the hour, where there are senators who are putting holds on nominees until, let's say, certain documents are produced in relation to these the investigations surrounding these scandals. That could go on for a long time. So late fourth quarter could be optimistic, even before you get a new chair. At the same time, there'll be a great deal of pressure from industry, wireless carriers, broadcasters, as well as Capitol Hill and third-party groups to get the auction underway. So what will happen? Will the three-member commission start to do that or not? That's actually probably, I can't answer that question. That's not an educated guess because I'm not there right now, and it's one of those three would have to have they'd have a better viewpoint. But anyway, that I think delays the auction a bit. I've been skeptical for a while that it could be done in a speedy way. And one other thing to consider is that because this literally will be the most complicated spectrum auction in history, and I'm not predicting this will happen, I'm going to say there's a slightly elevated risk, a slightly elevated litigation risk. With repacking, for broadcasters, you introduce the concept of irreparable harm. So while no spectrum auction has ever been set aside by a court, I think there's a slightly elevated risk that this one could be. I'm not saying it will be, just a slightly elevated risk.
Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. So with repacking, and the law says essentially that broadcasters have to have substantially similar signal contour. And there are other factors too, but if they end up not having a substantially similar signal contour and they get moved to a different channel and they're losing audience, we went through this with the digital TV transition 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago to the day. Initially, there were you had the high VHF issue and all the rest. That was then. There'll be other issues going forward, but there are a lot of moving parts here where a broadcaster may lose his or her audience or part of his audience, and that could constitute irreparable harm. So there are usually four prongs to get an injunction. Irreparable harm being one of them. Injunctions are still extremely hard to get. I'm not predicting that'll happen, but we don't know. So that's another element.
How would you do that with simultaneous?
Right. So, well, there's going to be this government-created software that's going to take care of that.
I hear a voice of skepticism in the audience.
It's going to be fine.
It's going to be fine.
Yeah,
don't worry about it.
Don't worry about it. I'm being facetious. I have no idea if it'll be fine. Well, you hope and pray that it'll be fine. I want it to be fine. But yes, so the simultaneous, after each round, there is software involved to determine the repacking. I'm not making this up.
It's if you could give an educated guess as to how much spectrum would be cleared. Are we looking at, you mentioned the number 60 megahertz. Could it be 90 megahertz? Could it be 120 megahertz?
Well, it won't be 120 merely because they forgot about Canada and Mexico. So I think it's going to be
closer to 60.
Well south and north of that. But
does that have to get, does Mexico and Canada have to be resolved before they can have an
Yeah, and that's ongoing, and there's been some developments. But yes, those have to be resolved, yeah. So I do like to ask where. So what market are we talking about?
Yeah.
You know, Cincinnati or, you know,
the middle of,
Laramie, Wyoming, or Manhattan. So it's got to be in broadcasters' interest, and I'm hopeful, but 60 or less might be, in some of these markets, might be what is actually produced. You know, so you kind of only need the spectrum in certain markets, you know, so.
Do you think the commission will try to, it's sounding like you're saying the commission won't necessarily have the same amount of spectrum nationwide, so it might have some amount in Manhattan and maybe more amount?
Well, I mean, it's a voluntary incentive auction, so it's got to be based, I mean, here's another, you're the economist, so tell me if I'm off base here, but it's got to be in broadcasters' economic self-interest to surrender spectrum. Now they can sell their 6 megahertz and cohabitate and you know, do channel sharing 3 and 3, but so it's got to be worth their while. So if you're in Manhattan, a broadcaster in New York, I don't know why I keep saying Manhattan. There are more boroughs than just Manhattan. New York, there are more eyeballs. The electricity costs are about the same there as they are anywhere. So there's more opportunity to make money as a broadcaster in a large, densely populated market like Chicago or Miami or New York.
Right.
So is there less of an incentive for them? There are more stations, by the way, too.
Right.
And most are not network affiliates. So you can make the argument, the counter argument, that there's more opportunity because there are more stations. But it's also perhaps easier for them to make money because there are more eyeballs packed into a small area.
Well, let me flip the question around. Let me just give a hypothetical. Let's say you were sitting on the board of a large wireless carrier, and the management of the company comes to you and says, there's this wonderful auction coming, and it's probably going to be on the state, and we want to be prepared to buy some spectrum. And you say, well, all right, well, how much spectrum do you want to buy? And the management says, well, we can't tell you because the government won't tell us how much spectrum is going to be available. But we want you to set up this line of credit for management for tens of billions of dollars, but we're not going to tell you how much spectrum is there. What do you think the board's going to do?
I guess get on their hands and knees to their bankers and try to get them to give them a line of credit. I don't know. It's there's so many unknowns and so many variables. I mean, in a way, if you could just let it happen, put everyone in a room and give them until 3 o'clock and then have them all come out, there'd probably be a lot of deals cut. But that's overly simplistic. There would be collusion problems and all the rest, so you can't do that. But this is the heart of my concern, is that there's an opaque nature. We don't know how much product there is to buy or where.
You mentioned one of your regrets as a commissioner was the public safety.
D-block vote?
The D-block. D-block, or public safety, again, is part of the new auction process as well. Do you think this time around they're going to get what they wanted, or are they going to get? They're going to fall through the cracks again?
Vis-a-vis the auction.
Yeah.
So they need the $7 billion. So that actually, that goal can help be the glue that could put together a coalition of votes, I think, at the commission to keep it simpler. And while there might be the desire to have all sorts of public policy outcomes as the result of more complicated auction, the notion of we've got to raise enough money at least for public safety, I think helps drive, well, I hope will help drive some decisions in the right direction, including who gets to participate in the auction. And that's another X factor. We also haven't talked about the unlicensed variable. But restricting who gets to bid will lower the values. I mean, you're the economist, tell me if I'm wrong. But if you exclude deeper pocketed bidders from an auction, the price will be less, and that's less of an incentive for broadcasters to surrender their spectrum. So there may be less spectrum yielded as a result. I don't know, is that a crazy economic theory?
No, I think it makes sense.
So then, but the counter pressure to that is the idea of a 30 megahertz or large chunk of unlicensed spectrum that is being pushed by some.
How do you see that playing out?
Well, my guess is there'll be a compromise. It seems to be a strong core philosophical issue for the proponents of it. I've questioned whether, let's say it's a 30 megahertz block, a nationwide block, makes economic sense in the unlicensed space. So when you talk 30 megahertz in this band, presumably you could juice that up with a lot of power, and the signals could travel a long distance and carry a lot of data. That means the construction of towers with a lot of electricity behind them, and that means a lot of money. A lot of money means licensed, exclusive use licenses, because if you're unlicensed, you're subject to harmful interference from other unlicensees, other users who aren't licensed, right? So if you think of when you were a kid, you had a walkie-talkie and you could hear the other kids in the neighborhood on the walkie-talkie. Well, that was harmful interference because that's unlicensed spectrum. Or baby monitors. If you heard someone else's baby cry in your monitor ever, that's unlicensed spectrum. So that's harmful interference. So 30 megahertz to me equals exclusive use license. Things like Wi-Fi are lower powered, less bandwidth, but still very fruitful. And I've been a proponent of unlicensed use, but it lends itself more, that concept lends itself more to lower powered devices, precisely because of the harmful interference issue. Then economically, and we're getting deep in the weeds here, but so there could be counter pressure though if less spectrum is available for exclusive use licenses. Does that increase prices? In other words, there's less of the resource of the valuable commodity, which is spectrum, less land, let's say, for sale. So does that drive up the price for the land that is for sale? I don't know, but the 30 megahertz unlicensed block is a head scratcher for me still.
You mentioned earlier the coordination with Canada and Mexico, and you said some progress is being made there. What is your sense of timing of those, and can the commission go to final rules without having completed coordination with Canada and Mexico?
I don't think it would be prudent for the commission to go to final rules. And I might be getting this backwards, but I think the Canadian talks are moving more quickly than the Mexican talks. They will be resolved, but there's a lot involved there. What's in it for Canada and Mexico? So there's the pain in the neck factor and the good neighbor aspects of all this. So I think it's very difficult to move forward, because for a lot of reasons, but let's say the repacking reason alone,
Sure.
where are people going to be on the dial and who's interfering with whom, it makes it difficult to come out with final orders, and then because then presumably you move to the auction relatively shortly thereafter. So I think it's another variable there that needs resolution.
Right. And you were mentioning on the unlicensed, has the commission ever designated below 3? I guess there was a recent 5 gigahertz speed that was set up.
That's in the statute too.
That's in the statute. But has the commission ever given exclusive use to unlicensed in lower bands?
I have to get
I
back
think
to
the answer is no.
I think the answer is no, but let me double check on that. This idea of exclusive use unlicensed is also what you just said. Is that what you meant to say?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, it sounds contradictory, but it is a concept out there. Do you guys remember? I'm not sure there's a. I don't know of any off the top of my head. Maybe there is, but
it's actually usually secondary. But
yes.
But this is actually kind of a new notion, I think, from a spectrum allocation perspective, to designate spectrum as unlicensed exclusively.
The way it's proposed would be novel. Yeah, this would be a precedent setting, and I'm not sure it would work. So is it really, under the is it really, the proponents of it, are they actually hoping for all the benefits of an exclusive use license without having to pay for it? Is another aspect of this.
But there's nothing to prevent a party who really believed in unlicensed to, at auction, go off and bid and acquire the rights to the license and then open it up for unlicensed.
Right, they could do that.
They
Sure.
could do that.
Well, presumably, if the rules allowed it, yeah.
Okay. No, this is fascinating. We could go on forever just chatting about all these things. I do want to open things up for the audience and for our online and Ustream viewers. It's at Hudson Institute. You can tweet your questions in for us, and we'll be happy to take them. I'm going to open it up to the floor for questions. I think any questions are permissible, and Commissioner McDowell will dodge the ones that he'll ask me the ones he doesn't want to answer. So,
I have to dodge fewer now. I have no excuse anymore. So.
This is probably true. So let's open it up for questions here.
Complaints?
Stunned silence.
There's one.
Yes.
Here's a complaint.
Right here.
Yeah. As soon as I said complaints, he raised his hand.
Please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Ryan Kaldar. I just had a question with regard to cybersecurity. I'm not sure if, I guess, with regard to DoD accepting this sort of concept of bring your own device, wireless handsets, is that something that concerns you? With it used to be dominated by people bringing BlackBerries and being controlled by the government's IT people in-house. Now that the iPhone and the Android devices have sort of emerged and have gained acceptance within different government divisions, is that something that concerns you with regard to cybersecurity?
I'm not sure I completely understand your question. So, do you know what he's?
So you're opening it up from BlackBerries to
other
the
devices,
iPhone,
right?
and
Exactly.
Yeah, this is a pretty technical question, and thankfully the FCC doesn't get too involved with that. That's DHS and DoD and others, as you said. So, I'm going to assume for a moment that that's had all the technical reviews and that the security aspects. Obviously, the government loved research in motion because of the security aspects of the BlackBerry. And from at least as of 2 weeks ago, I couldn't get FCC email on my iPhone. Is that still the case? Yeah. So Nick's saying yes. So if they found a technical solution to it, that's great. If that's a real technical question, I really can't opine as to whether or not I think it's good or not, because I'm not a technical expert on that. Sorry.
Okay.
It's an honest answer, though.
Sit over here.
Hi, James Tsai. This is kind of a 101 question, and it harkens back to your earlier point about different agencies, different regulatory regimes, kind of regulating the internet, in the quotes. My question deals with privacy. It looks like there's concurrent jurisdiction between the FTC, the DOJ, FCC. Could you just give a primer 101 on how is privacy regulated on the internet, and then the second follow-up question is, do you think it's a good regime that we have right now, and what further steps can we take to modify or not?
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting issue. So the FCC, in my view, thankfully, has a very small role in privacy. It's really sort of customer information. There's for common carriers, satellite, for cable, but it all kind of hinges on customer information, and that's kind of the extent of it. So I would say the primary privacy agency is the Federal Trade Commission. I think it makes sense going forward, if you're going to have an administrative agency work on this, to have essentially one. Obviously, there would be support and advice and collaboration with others, but it's a very dynamic issue. It evolves every second of every day, and also generationally, it's going to be interesting. You know, the bedrock of privacy is the expectation of privacy, and so I might have a different expectation of privacy than my goddaughter, who turns 20 today, of her expectation of privacy. And as we can see through what folks post on Facebook or what they tweet out or whatever. So I think in this country anyway, the notion of what should remain private or what is to be protected by law, that might evolve to be, there's going to be less protected by law, just because people's expectations of privacy are going to change. I can't speak for the Europeans. They have a completely different view. But I sense technology might shape opinion on a generational basis over there as well.
If I could just follow up on that question a bit. My sense is every federal agency now has a chief privacy officer, and every federal agency just about has some special privacy rules. Some of them affect just about every American. So Department of Human Services with HIPAA and the privacy rules governing medical records. Department of Education, privacy rules governing educational records. There are a lot of different rules that govern the disclosure of financial records. So any bit of information that's on the internet could be governed by a lot of different federal rules. And the transmission, even the security standards for the transmission of information varies by agency. I have a friend who has a company that does transmission of certain medical information, which has an entirely different standard than the FCC has for transmission of secure information. So the privacy issues are both the sort of the generic types that Commissioner McDowell was describing that govern all private information, but then within the federal government, as far as I know, just about every federal agency has a privacy officer and all kinds of agency-specific privacy rules. And I don't know, there must be someone who coordinates all this. I'm not even sure of that. Next question. Up here. We get the microphone and please identify yourself.
Good afternoon, Commissioner. My name is Todd Wiggins. I have been in the audience to some of your presentations for the Minority Media Telecom organization, which is very viable and very important organization, and they have hosted many different events, and you've been invited, and you've spoken eloquently. I want to thank you for that, for what you've shared. I wanted to ask you about the general topic of countrywide broadband access, which I'm sure you know about as much as anyone. How much progress have we made towards that goal in, say, the last several years? since you've been speaking about it and been addressing it, and how important is it for the citizens of the United States to have access in outlying rural areas, and what progress is as far as, and what's the necessity as far as education for the future as we try to balance our power as far as technological exposure versus what's happening in certain other countries where they have more access?
Excellent question. Good to see you again. I'll be speaking at MMTC in July. So in 2003, about 15% of the American population had broadband available to it. By 6 years later, by the end of 2009, about 95% do. Just read an article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about the growth, the disruptive nature of the growth of wireless broadband. Wireless broadband is the fastest growing segment of the broadband market. Low income people are jumping to use that at a higher adoption rate than upper income because their wireless device has become their personal computer. And because they can go to a coffee shop or a school or a library or a lot of places and get Wi-Fi for free. So there's now a trend, it's still in its infancy, of redefining the notion of cutting the cord, which is to not have a broadband subscription. And I've actually been saying for years that actually there's probably a large population out there of broadband users who are not subscribers. So when you look at OECD rankings and things of that nature, they're counting subscribers and subscribers per household and things like that. We're not taking into account broadband users, just the universe of broadband users who may not be actually paying for a subscription or registered anywhere. So that growth curve from 03 to 09, like this, literally the hockey stick, I think is very encouraging. That was before there was a national broadband plan. Adoption.
I have to ask, did you ever vote on a national broadband plan?
I did not.
Did any commissioner ever vote on a national broadband plan?
No, sir.
Thank you.
I feel like I was back before Congress. Are you John Dingell? No, this is good. No, this is good. Feel free to interrupt. That was good. No, we didn't. The Stimulus Act called for the creation of one. I actually suggested to Chairman Janikowski that we not vote on it because I wanted it to be his plan or the team's plan.
It's not a commission plan.
It was not a commission plan. Did I say it was a commission plan?
No.
No? Okay.
No, I just wanted to clarify.
Right. It was not adopted by the FCC. It was a 400-plus page document, so I figured it'd be impossible for us to vote on it, really. So anyway, just let them get it out the door. They had a statutory deadline. And so I think the thrust of the momentum and the direction has been good. I think when you look at the cost per bit, basically, of information has come way down. So the costs have gone down and innovation has gone up. So in 03, the concept of even 7 years ago when I started the FCC, the concept of a smartphone didn't exist, tablets didn't exist. The iPhone didn't debut until 2007. So I think the thrust has been terrific and democratic with a small d. We're seeing far more computing power than the entire Apollo program had that put people on the moon in the hands of more and more people who never could have imagined that, and in this country and throughout the globe. So I actually think that a lot of the future regarding broadband is in wireless. I think we're just now entering the golden age of wireless. So I tend to be an optimist. I had all that pessimistic talk earlier, so I can be an optimist now about it reaching all income levels through that. And as I said before, I have been a believer in unlicensed use, but not in a 30 megahertz swath across the country. I just don't think that works pragmatically. Wi-Fi has been tremendously popular. It was almost one of those things where on Friday nobody had heard of it, and by Monday everybody had it. It spread that fast. So, in libraries, in schools, in a lot of places, churches, coffee shops, college campuses, FedEx offices. Didn't know that. Free Wi-Fi in FedEx offices. That makes sense. Good to know. So there are more and more venues where you're going to be able to get that, and there are new generations of Wi-Fi coming out here in the next few months. So I'm very hopeful that actually this will help improve the human condition, not just here at home, but throughout the globe.
Next question. In the back.
Michael Crowwork. I was just wondering if you touched earlier about the ongoing spectrum negotiations with Canada, Mexico. I was just wondering if you could outline exactly what those negotiations are on and whether you think further integration with North American partners is beneficial for the FCC.
Right, so I don't have any real-time breaking news for you, but it basically hinges on interference. So they have TV stations on certain channels, and we went through this just 5 years ago with the DTV transition. So we're trying to avoid harmful interference to their stations. We're trying to make sure that that by repacking, by moving around where our TV broadcasters will be on the dial, so to speak, that doesn't cause them any more headaches than necessary. Again, this is our incentive auction; it's not theirs. So what's in it for them to be accommodating us to have to move their broadcasters around? So but it all boils down to harmful interference and sort of equities overall, I would say. And it absolutely has to be resolved, but I'm hopeful that it will be.
We have a question from Twitter from Mike Nelson.
Hi, Mike.
I was just going to say, hi, Mike.
Oh, that's right.
And his question is, are we worrying too much about the ITU? Can't China, Russia, and other countries lock down their part of the internet without the ITU?
Excellent question. So, no, we're not worrying about it too much. And yes, these countries can do what they want on their own. The concern is having a new international regulatory overlay that is sort of a race to the bottom. There's a lowest common denominator that the standards of internet governance and the regulation of its content and economics would be according to the proponents, the countries that are proposing these ideas. So while we can hopefully with some confidence, that the United States doesn't sign on to such a treaty or would not want to go in that direction, how it affects the American internet consumer in the short and intermediate term, I think, is there's chaos created which increases costs. So the uncertainty increases costs and also has the potential to squelch innovation. And the reason being is that the internet is a global network of networks without borders. And so whatever content you're pulling or transmitting is going to travel all over the world before it arrives at its destination. And you don't know where it's going. And so from an engineering perspective, how do you bifurcate the internet? How do you have an iron curtain across it? It becomes very difficult. And yes, folks from eBay or Google might tell you they have to deal with China and Iran and Saudi Arabia, all who have famous walled gardens or firewalls. So what is the difference? Well, the difference is it just gets worse by adding this new international component to it that has the force and effect of international law. So a lot of things that, I asked this very question, by the way, to the Internet Architecture Board a little over a year ago. And this is a non-governmental private sector nonprofit group. These are the engineers that keep the internet working and thriving and growing. And they're not political, they're not in it for their own businesses, they're acting in their own capacity, and these are just engineers who love the art of the engineering that goes into it. And I asked this very question to them, and they said, well, the things that are free on the internet will no longer be free. There are a lot of things out there, it'll just be harder to do. So that affects all of us. It would undermine the developing world the most. The developing world stands to gain the most from an unfettered internet, and stands to lose the most from one that's regulated. And it's unfortunate that there are so many votes from the developing world. Also a few in the developed world, and might be more coming, and that's another topic. But so excellent question. but we are not worrying too much about the ITU.
Let's take one more question over here on the side.
Hi, Commissioner. Tom Martin, Healthcare Information and Management Systems Society. You brought up the National Broadband Plan, and was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of the FCC in healthcare, specifically the Connect funds and some of the Universal Service funds. And then one other recent thing, the development of medical body area networks. You talked a little bit about crosstalk. Do you think there's going to be a need for healthcare-specific spectrum allocations outside of M-band in the future?
Excellent question. So under the umbrella of our Universal Service Subsidy Program, there we go. There.
Federal.
Yeah. Our country. There we go. Okay. Having left 2 weeks ago, though, I keep lurching into the we, and after 7 years, I got to recondition myself. But anyway, the FCC has a $8+ billion a year subsidy program called the Universal Service Program. There are 4 funds under it. The smallest is the Rural Healthcare Fund, which is a little more than $400 million, I think. Right, guys? Yeah, more or less. And I'm looking at the PI office to help me out here with the specifics. That was somewhat repurposed recently, with the notion also of anchor institutions. I had some concerns that there were some attempts to redefine some urban clinics to be rural, so that rural no longer meant rural, it meant also urban. And that to me was a bit of mission creep and outside the scope of what Congress had intended, and that wasn't our job or within our authority to do that. But it is to allow rural healthcare providers to have broadband connectivity, essentially. But also now with the notion of make those anchor institutions to where the private sector in rural areas could then kind of plug into those pipes that are brought out to rural hospitals or clinics. The second part of your question was, M-bands. Yeah. So the Alfred Mann petition was this orphaned petition that had been sitting for a while at the commission. There was a conflict between FAA and the FCC, and early in 2009, there's also the GE medical petition, kind of a twin petition. So this is for to allow very low wattage, milliwatts of power in certain frequencies for medical devices. Alfred Mann petition focused on these implants into the limbs of victims of paralysis, stroke or accident or military conflict or whatever, and you had these electrodes that would stimulate muscles to allow limbs to be used again. They'd be connected, they'd kind of replicate the nervous system through wireless connections. Absolutely revolutionary, sort of, $6 Million Man, for anyone's old enough to remember that show, kind of stuff, but his was wireline, not wireless, so this is wireless. And FAA was concerned that these small milliwatts of power would interfere with planes and things like that. So it was hung up for a very long time. And also same with the GE medicals for M-bands. I think, short answer, medical uses in wireless are also just in their infancy, and I think there's a tremendous new frontier out there. So medical apps and wireless in that area, I think we've just scratched the surface. I think it's going to be wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I just hope government can move more quickly and fast enough to accommodate all the wonderful innovations in that space.
And with that, please join me in thanking Commissioner McDowell for a wonderful talk.
Thank you for having me.